first, I know the main thing that we're here to talk about is the Maryland Voting Rights Act. Can you just give us like a top level? What is the Maryland VRA?
Yeah, I'm going to try and give it in the shortest way possible. But, I'm sure that many are aware that we have the Federal Rights Act of 1965, right? This is where, Black Americans literally lobbied, died, right, to put protections in place that ensured that, Black voters, that we had the same political power, right? And that we weren't being disenfranchised. And unfortunately, what we've seen at the federal level, even before Trump, we were already gutting provisions that were necessary within the VRA. But I would say under this administration and based on the blueprint that they outlined in Project 2025, I think now Project 2026, their goal is to use tactics that ensure that Black and brown voters are being disenfranchised. So what we're trying to do is insulate Maryland, right? What we want is, they're going to take away the protection at the federal level. Fine, we're going to put them in place here in the state and build on that, right? So that means everything from the translation requirements, especially a state as diverse as ours, making sure that we go beyond the threshold that was already there and expand it to languages like Amharic and so forth. Looking at things like vote dilution, voter intimidation and suppression, where we really don't have any process in place for holding, those individuals accountable, right? So really putting whatever protections we can in place, because in this climate, in our proximity to DC also, I would say that we are kind of like an easy target.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And I guess playing devil's advocate here, one of the big things is that a lot of people look and say, okay, Maryland's a Democratic state, we're deep blue,
Mhm.
and they think of, okay, we shouldn't be having any of these like problems when it comes to voting or voting
Mhm.
rights in general. And some people may look and say, well, we have like the Federal Voting Rights Act
Mhm.
and everyone is allowed to vote, and they kind of say like we shouldn't have intimidation.
Mhm.
Can you kind of talk about what are like some of the misnomers that people think to say we don't need the VRA, but
Yep.
why we actually do need it instead?
Yeah. And, we've actually had this bill introduced now. I think this is the fourth year, right? Different iterations. We split it up, then we had a big omnibus and so forth. But, legislators, when they heard about the bill and looked through it, that was actually their response, right? Maryland, we are, we're blue. We have really accessible elections. We've managed to make a lot of progress. And they are right? Maryland is not like an Alabama, right? Or Texas, right? You have multiple options for voting, multiple days. You can register to vote up until election day. But that doesn't mean that Maryland, just as other states, are not vulnerable right now. And I would also say in our election processes, there's a lot of gaps, right? Again, we've talked about voting rights for incarcerated citizens. We've talked about some of the barriers that voters with disabilities and so forth face, right? So, we still had a lot of improvements to make, but I think, what people don't realize, I always say blue, depending on who, because I don't think we're as blue as people think. It took us 10 years to pass a reform like same date registration, right? That is a no brainer. And you would think in our General Assembly that something like that would move fairly quickly. And it did not. It took a ton of organizing, indivisibles, and so forth jumping in. I always tell national groups, they come in and Maryland, we just gonna pass this thing. And I think they had this rude awakening where even on elections, right, things that feel like they should be like no brainers, do it. We face a lot of opposition, right? And some of it just comes down to lack of political will, nothing else, right? And I think obviously legislators are always worried about themselves and their seats and, more competitive races and so forth. But even in a blue state, it is extremely difficult for us to pass reforms that are in the best interest of voters, right? I think mail in voting is a great example where we wouldn't have made it this far, unfortunately, if it weren't for the pandemic.